just to start here, from your perspective, working in national security and defense, what are you seeing happening in Ukraine that the average person might not pick up on?
Well, I think the gravity of the situation, that this is the biggest war in Europe since World War II, and what a Rubicon Putin has crossed by doing this. I think that's number one. Number two, obviously, is just making sure that people understand it's not just a Russia-Ukraine thing, that China is watching and taking notes on everything that's going on right now. Frankly, every would-be autocrat in the world is watching to see how Europe responds and how the United States responds, to see like, hey, you know, maybe this is something I should do, go invade my neighbor, go take Taiwan if you're China. So the implications are much bigger. And then obviously, you know, we are in an alliance with NATO. And if Putin moves his attention from Ukraine to a NATO nation, that's a very different ballgame. You know, that's a treaty alliance where we're supposed to come to their mutual aid. So those are the things that I watch. And then obviously, like everybody, the implications that are going to affect our gas pumps, availability of things like fertilizer from Belarus for our farmers, and aluminum and wheat. And, you know, there's no way in a global economy that this can happen and there's not pain, and just trying to mitigate that pain for the American citizens is what I've been thinking about.
I do want to circle back to sort of the almost World War I style domino effect that could happen here, but I think a lot of people are struggling with the idea about why do we care about what's happening. Like, I think people understand that that every autocrat in the world is watching this happening, but we don't feel like the US is on their list of places to invade. So I think a lot of people are having a hard time getting their heads around, you know, why we should care as the United States.
So I think, you know, it's a good question. You know, why should we care if one nation tries to take over another nation as long as they're very far away? And the answer is because, you know, just like, you know, if you're living in a small town and your neighbor does something small on your property and you don't make a big deal out of it, well, you shouldn't be surprised the next time when they do, you know, a much bigger thing on your property. It teaches the wrong lesson to a country like Russia, and suddenly it becomes normal for countries to invade each other. And the United States has a long history, frankly, of watching things, for instance, before World War II. It was a time of real isolationism for the United States. We didn't want to get involved in another world war. So what? Hitler was invading other countries around his neighborhood, but it didn't affect us until we got hit at Pearl Harbor, until the world had just gone crazy enough that we got drawn into it. So you got to nip things in the bud. And I think that's why, and it's hard to understand because it is far away, but if we don't respond to this kind of aggression, one nation taking over the other, we shouldn't be surprised when it starts to happen in a lot of places with a lot bigger implications for the US.
In that same vein, are sanctions enough here?
Well, I think the fundamental question is, do people want their sons and daughters, their American kids, going off to fight on behalf of Ukraine? And if there's already a concern, like, why are we getting involved in this? Then you can imagine how reticent people will be to get us into another big war somewhere very far away. So if you're not willing to commit American blood, frankly, to the situation, then you've got to look at other tools in your toolkit. Sanctions can be devastating, but military aid to the Ukrainians, I'm a big believer in ramping up what we give the Ukrainians to at least allow them to defend themselves. Export controls, so Russia can't get a hold of any technology or any spare parts when their military vehicles start to break down. So these aren't perfect, but unless we decide as a nation that we want to go to war on behalf of Ukraine, then the tools are necessarily not the same as the one that Putin's using in Ukraine.
How worried are you about Putin taking that next step into a NATO country that would involve the US in a much different way?
So, you know, I think Putin is just kind of a bit unhinged, and he's been so isolated for 2 years. He's been super paranoid about COVID and seeing very few people. And I think he's just turned 70. He's thinking about his legacy. He's giving these crazy kind of megalomania speeches. So, you know, I don't want to say he wouldn't touch the NATO countries. I think that's yet to be seen. But what we are seeing is like we've got NATO resources, NATO military assets really close to Ukraine. So I'm seeing initial reports, for instance, that a Romanian vessel was hit. No idea if it's accidental, right? When you start to be in that close of proximity, you start to have a real risk of miscalculation, of accidents. Suddenly we think he's firing on a NATO country. We respond. You can see how dangerous that is. So I don't know that he's decided to go after NATO, but mistakes can be made that end up in NATO soldiers, NATO resources being hit, and all of a sudden it's a different ballgame.
Whenever we talk about Russia and war activities, right, the specter of the Cold War and nuclear threat creeps up on people. How concerned are you about that in this conflict?
Listen, the reason why the Cold War was largely cold and done kind of, in the shadows was because we're both nuclear powers and no one likes the idea of a war between nuclear powers. It just brings in a level of risk where we could decimate each other's population. I mean, it's horrible. I had this experience when I was at the Pentagon and the Russians came into Syria. And suddenly we had American planes and Russian planes within some cases 1,000 feet of each other in the air. Very dangerous. And all you could think about was like, if we misunderstand each other here, this could cycle up and suddenly you got two nuclear powers, kind of like pointing at each other. Listen, I don't think that we're really on the brink of any kind of nuclear exchange, God forbid, right? But whenever you have two big nuclear powers like that, you have to think of worst case scenarios. And that's it.
China gets involved. We see sort of an axis alignment kind of thing when we think about World War II terms, right? And what that means for a more economic war here.
I think the China thing for Michigan is the big enchilada. I really do. And I would just say, I watched with interest that Russia and China signed a friendship agreement on February 3rd or 4th, that China has come down on the side of Putin, even though they had been saying, hey, no country has the right to invade another. I think they're feeling their way through this kind of new friendship. And all I know is that is not good for the United States. That is not an alliance that we've ever seen. And it's not one that makes us more secure. And certainly on the economic side, I've heard John McCain used to call Russia a gas station with an army, right? They've got oil and gas and they've got an army and they don't make anything else. They're not really major economic power. China has us over a barrel 25 different ways, right? Because we've outsourced too far to them. So the economic damage that China could impose on us if they did the exact same thing, except instead of Ukraine, it's Taiwan. That is the big competition, the big game for the next decade or two.
Are you worried about the first step being electric vehicles and specifically the batteries for electric vehicles that could end up, being sort of a national security risk here? Because I think it's like 90% of most of the minerals either come from or go through China. So in your head, is that where they start? And that obviously affects us in Michigan.
100%. I think that supply chain issues have become national security issues. And COVID really exposed that, right? We couldn't get a 78-cent mask for our nurses in the beginning. And now a 14-cent microchip has held up production at plants in Lansing for almost a year. I think that absolutely the Chinese look at the future of, that next gen of military vehicles. They're electric and they want to build them. They want to control them. They want to have the minerals, the batteries, and everything else in the supply chain. So we either acknowledge that and get in the game, or we just watch our kids work for Chinese companies instead of American companies. So the biggest announcement that I have seen on this front, like really truly historic, is the big announcement GM just made in Lansing, the big electric vehicle battery facility, this new facility built from a greenfield ground up. Not to, it's great jobs and it's all that, but it's also like us seriously in the game to win the next generation of vehicles. And if not, China and certainly our friends down south are happily ready to receive the ball so that Michigan isn't producing that next generation. So we got to get in the game, and that GM announcement was us getting in the game.
The last thing I'm going to ask here is, I don't know if you find this interesting too, but the parallels between the early 20th century and now the early 21st century. Is there something sort of eerie about that to you, that we just have history repeating itself almost in an identical way?
Well, look, I think there are some parallels, and I think the most important thing is, like, I'm still a believer in a strong American leadership role in the world. And I think when we say to ourselves, and we sort of feel like, you know what, we're tired, we don't want to have that strong role, we don't want to be engaged in the world, you know, then others fill the vacuum and it doesn't go any better for us. We end up having to get involved anyways. So I'm a big believer that it still matters, and that our leadership is always better than Chinese leadership or Russian leadership. We're not perfect, but we're better than those two. I do, the parallels are not great, but we still have decisions that can change the future.